Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are calling in from. Welcome to the Q3 Polygon update with Mark Boron, the CEO of Polygon Labs, and Sandeep Nawal, the Polygon founder and CEO of Polygon Foundation. I am Jacqueline Melanik. I'm the founder of Token Relations, and I'll be the one moderating this report today. In addition to the discussion, we will open up the floor to Q&A at the end from the community members. So if you have any questions, post them in the replies or save them for the end and we'll try to get to you. With that said, let's start with some remarks from Sandeep.
Yeah, first of all, thank you everyone for tuning in from all across the world. Mark is going to get into all the nitty gritties and details, but before that, I wanted to share a few things that I'm personally excited about. For us, primarily, Q3 was about scale. We saw more users, lower costs, deeper adoption across payments, institutions, and new markets, and so many more things. But the most important theme that I see that is going on right now is that the Polygon story is finally moving beyond Web3. And why it is more exciting for me, I keep saying this part that um, Polygon became known for its mainstream adoption back in 2022, 2023. If you saw, we brought in many enterprises, like literally a large part of Fortune 500 would have done a lot of things in Web3 using Polygon. And why I bring that back is that even at that time we were looking and we were chasing utility in Web3, and we wanted to take Web3 beyond this niche speculative environment. And the good part is, due to stable coins and payments, that is actually happening now, and we feel right on our home turf doing that. And as Mark will walk you through some of the details, you will see that how we are now playing on a turf where it is our natural strength to be doing stuff, bringing stuff on Polygon, which has actual real world utility. And also, why I say this not only for Polygon but beyond Polygon is that the it's not about like building the next layer of finance and all that. This is now has become, the crypto has now become an industry which enables real people, real businesses to move money and real value across the globe faster, cheaper, and in a more trustless manner. So, and obviously trustless manner, and removing all of these intermediaries in between, which end up eating a large chunk of the cost or large chunk of the money that is moving across. um, for me, the five most important thing that I would say that stood out in this quarter, obviously the first one is the network scaling. And you would have seen that the network we had are one of the most critical upgrades. Recently, the vBlob upgrade that also went absolutely flawlessly, and that now gives us the ability to provide first, like, almost instant confirmations for the transactions. Then it also gives us the ability to not have reorgs on Polygon POS chain, which has been a big point of concern for some of the developers. So that reorgs going away makes the chain, like the finality of the chain, extremely fast. But this new upgrade also enables us to now scale the blockchain from, like, where we, this year only we went from 200 to 1000 TPS, but now we will go from, this gives us the opportunity to go from 1000 TPS to 5000 TPS within probably this year or next 2-3 months. And then overall, in the next 12 to 24 months, our goal will be to go to like 100,000 transactions per second kind of capacity and throughput for the chain, which will put Polygon right up there with the high throughput chains like Solana, Sui, Aptos, and many more. Second thing is, like, we can clearly see that the payments are taking off. We can see a lot of payment companies as well as the P2P transfers picking up very heavily on Polygon POS, which is the most kind of exciting sign for us. Other thing that we are also seeing, the third thing is that the institutions are also stepping up. We are having discussions with some of the topmost institutions in the world, and they all want to get onboarded onto blockchains for doing their stable coins and payment related transactions, and also tokenizing their own deposits, balance sheets, treasury funds, and so much more. Similarly, I think another thing that is very heartwarming for me is that we can see the emerging markets are driving adoption, and most of them are choosing Polygon because of the extremely low gas fees and its interconnectivity, where Polygon is connected into almost every avenue that you can possibly imagine, be in crypto versus non-crypto, on ramps, off ramps, exchanges, large apps. Stripe, you already saw that even Stripe, when Stripe is launching their product, there the demos are built on Polygon. You can see when Tether recently announced their wallet, and previously some other applications also, the demos are generally happening on Polygon in the background that you would see, is because of the extreme interconnectivity of Polygon blockchain and its battle testedness. We recently saw like a 4.5 million, 5 million, around 4.5 to 5 million transactions per day on the blockchain also. And with this V block, which has happened recently, this will only go higher and higher. And as I said, as I mentioned, like the summary of all that is that that all of this is happening while the performance is just now beginning to improve, faster finality, lower gas fees, and reliability that Polygon chain is known for. But now once we start increasing our throughput and take it to 10, 20, 30, 50,000, I think you'll start seeing Polygon POS as the chain where not only the payments and everything is happening, but that will also start sucking in a lot of other activities which are peripheral to payments. So as I said, that now this is where you see the Web3 is no longer a niche, but it's powering the overall real economy of the world. And Polygon, and Polygon team, as well as the ecosystem, we rightly feel at home on our home turf, because the now world is moving, the Web3 is moving towards actual utility, and that too on a global scale. So it's super exciting for us. I'll now hand over to Mark, who will walk you through some of the deeper details behind these results and what I spoke about.
Yeah,
Over to you
amazing.
guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandeep. That's super valuable. I mean, we're going to be talking about payments, B2B transfers, institutional adoption, all these different aspects too. So you really queued it up for Mark. We're going to dive deep into the Polygon trenches, so to speak, right now. And we could start with some overall metrics, Mark. Can you kind of walk us through this initial snapshot here, kind of highlighting what has happened in Q3?
Yeah, and as Sandeep said, thanks for everyone for tuning in. But also building on what Sandeep said, yeah, it was a great quarter, and I think this is reflected in the high-level metrics, right? 345 million total transactions in Q3, just another kind of like big number, makes Polygon again a leader in terms of transactions on chain in general. The price of Pol continues to stay low at under 100th of a cent, and key thing here being the consistency of that pricing across usage of that network continues to be better and better. And those fees continue to get lower and lower, making it more desirable to use the chain. Average monthly addresses at 7.3 million active addresses. Again, an important number in terms of showing the breadth of usage of users on the chain. Sometimes there are duplicate addresses, but in general, it reflects a very high number of users on the chain. And then similarly, the daily active addresses at 590,000 shows the activity happening on the chain. And then lastly, the DeFi TVL sitting at 1.15 billion in TVL, very heavy in stable coins, which is consistent with the payments focus that we have. Again, puts us in a good position there.
I also want to talk to you, Mark, about Polygon as a chain for payments, tokenization, and programmable money. Can you kind of give me an overview of like the early data you're seeing on this front with stablecoins and payments that might tell us how the network is actually being used and adopted?
Yeah, so this is all consistent with the focus that we've had on stablecoins and payments. And so we now have the stablecoin supply at 3.4 billion, which is an all-time high, reflecting more users wanting to use the chain for payments and more fintechs and neobanks bringing their users over. We did see a significant decrease actually in stablecoin volumes to 198 billion. Looking at the data behind this, it's actually reflected by specific less usage of Aave from a lending perspective. And so as a lot of the usage of lending has shifted from Aave to other lending protocols that have decided to incentivize and come into the Polygon ecosystem, there's this blip that we see where the usage of Aave, which has been very significant in the Polygon ecosystem, has been decreasing, and usage of others have started to increase. So I think with time, we're going to start seeing those numbers like shifting in a meaningful way. Stablecoin transfers as a whole are up by 21% from Q2 to 287 million. So I think distinction between those transfers and that volume is really important, right? Because when you look often in crypto at stablecoin volumes, they're driven by a significant number of like whales that are transacting in borrowing, lending, or DEX transactions. But the stablecoin transfers and the number of them generally reflect more everyday usage of the network for specific purposes. And so for us, seeing that increase in transactions is really important. It's also important to note that like the increase in transactions is really what drives fees rather than the volume, which is different from many other networks. As a blockchain, it's really the transfers, not the volume, that matters. Payment provider volume, in terms of those payments, were up to 1.8 billion, which is an all-time high in Q3. This is a number we'll dig into more, but is a really important number for us. And then more than 50% growth in payments transfers from Q2. So as I was kind of talking about, we differentiate between kind of the stablecoin transfer volume versus stablecoin transfers. We also differentiate between kind of payments transfers versus pure stablecoin transfers, because those, again, narrow down a little bit deeper into specifically what we are focused on building at Polygon.
So see a lot of comments coming in from Polygon community members, which is great. So if you guys have questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on it and we'll get to them at the end. And Mark, to kind of the comments you were making before, it looks like, people are actually using Polygon based off those metrics. But what would you say it's for mainly? Is it this payment provider side or something else?
Yeah, so I think the key here, and we can see it from the growth in this chart, is payment provider volume in general on Polygon continues to increase like very meaningfully. So we're talking about a 49% quarter-over-quarter growth, which is very, very significant. It's an all-time high at 693 million in September. I think importantly, as I touched on, right, is when we're focused on payments, the question is always, what do those payments look like? Where do they come from? And a lot of people wonder, what's the source of those? And a lot of this is the many different fintechs, neobanks, payment service providers that are coming onto Polygon and having their users choose Polygon as their default chain. And that's created a significant drive in increased volumes. And it looks like post Q3, those numbers are continuing to increase significantly. So we'll be excited to update when that happens.
Yeah, and I want to move into the next slide as well, because there's obviously a lot of payments and financial applications that are using it. Are there any specifically that kind of stand out to you from this, or how do you kind of like characterize all of these different applications that are building or using Polygon?
Yeah, and I think this shows like a meaningful portion of those payments providers. I think there's quite a few more. I think the important thing is the diversity here in terms of what you see, whether it's like on-ramps and off-ramps, or cards, or fintechs. And then when you look at whether that is globally, right, whether you look in the UK with Revolut, in the US with Robinhood, or you go to Latin with something like Lemon, you're really talking about a very global presence, which when you're thinking about a payments network, that's what you care about. And so I think we could dig into every single one of these who are having like very real impact that. But overall, the general idea is it's very diverse in terms of like size and regionally. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah. I also want to talk to you about P2P transfer volume. Sandeep mentioned it before, and you've touched on it too. In the next slide, we kind of talk about the importance of this data here. I mean, you could kind of dive into it, but I want to know, like, how is Polygon specifically different from other methods of sending and receiving money? I'm seeing comments come in where people are saying they literally just use Polygon for stablecoin transfers, which is great. But I'd love to hear from your perspective what this data really means.
Yeah. So I think the important thing here is like when we think of payments, what we care about is the everyday person, everyday company being able to make those payments, right? And so when we kind of look at what types of payments are being used, a lot of times it's USDC being used. And so we look at the addresses and the consistency of those addresses and growth over time, or really how it's changing over time, right? And so in Q3, we had 2.8 million average monthly active addresses, which continues to be like very, very high. Shows like a market share in terms of USDC addresses of 22% across like every chain. That's down from 28% across every chain. And I think the important thing here again is really the everyday person, holding a new wallet and growth in that, or consistency in the number of wallets there. And I think having a decrease in market share on that is actually okay, as long as that doesn't come with a decrease in kind of transactions in general, and especially not in volumes when it comes to payments providers, which we saw earlier.
Yeah, I mean, people are doing financial transactions on Polygon, and the monthly P2B transfer volume saw an enormous jump quarter over quarter, which we could kind of look at here. And you could see in the top right corner. Can you kind of talk to us about how you see the payments focus, already bearing fruit? And also just this 47% quarter over quarter growth is just wild.
Yeah. So I think one important thing is how we distinguish between like P2P transfers and others, right? So the important thing here is looking at transfers that do not hit like smart contracts in general, so that we can be confident that these are P2P transfers as they say. So hitting an all-time high of 5 billion is fantastic. I think the key thing here is that the impact that it is having on everyday payments. Again, what this shows is people are actually using this to pay each other. And this is not, you don't see these numbers from that happening just in one region. You see that from, happening globally. And seeing that kind of consistent increase, I think, is the thing that's most exciting, right? Like 130% like year-to-date growth is a very real increase that does not seem to be stopping, right? We saw like a little minor blip decrease in August, and then another even more meaningful increase again in September. And when we look at this over like quarter over quarter, it's 47% growth, which again is very meaningful. So I think this area is one of the ones to pay attention to, along with the payment providers that we were touching on earlier. I think when you look at those two things, these are two like very important metrics that we follow to see what growth is looking like.
Yeah, on this point though, what providers are you saying would drive the payments volume right now on Polygon?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is, if we look at the prior slides that we went at, right? It's that big mix of providers in general, right? So we've got the Revoluts, the Robinhoods, but also again, like regionally, a different mix. And so we're seeing that. I think where we'll talk about a little bit, which I think is exciting, is that mix between LATAM being one very big driver, and then also Southeast Asia being another big driver. I think in Revolut in general has, I think it had a small dip in August, and then a very big increase again in September. And so I think it's a mix of those.
Yeah, and also I feel like we're talking about stable coins, P2P transfers, and then another very hot topic right now is tokenization. And I would love to kind of migrate into that conversation about real world assets, tokenization, and for you to explain what that is first, and then why do you see Polygon among the best chains for, RWAs, tokenization of assets, and so on?
Yeah, so the tokenization of assets really just refers to bringing real world assets, so assets outside of a blockchain onto a blockchain using tokenization. And I think the first form of that people think of most is stablecoins, right? Those are like the biggest area right now in terms of real world assets and assets outside of blockchains coming on chain. But when we talk about real world assets in general here, we're leaving aside stablecoins. We just dug into those quite a bit. So now we're really looking at outside of that. And this is a second area where we've spent a lot of time and I think are quite differentiated in terms of the activity, right? So outside of Ethereum, we have 273 RWAs on Polygon, which is more than any other chain. Those assets have $1.1 billion of value on chain. I think importantly is there's more than like 3,000 RWA holders. A lot of times there's a lot of concentration in these, and seeing that there's quite a few holders here is really great to see. And then like we dig in, and on the next slide we'll talk about this a little, but we like looking at the specific areas where we stand out. And when it comes to like corporate bonds, we have 90% of the market share there. And so you can kind of see this here where the biggest kind of amount is commodities, right? Like a huge number of RWAs in the form of commodities on chain. Second to that being what I just touched on is corporate bonds in general. And then followed by government bonds, US treasuries, private credit. And private credit is one area that I would say is like very hot right now. If you talk to almost anyone who's looking to bring RWAs on chain, they're working on private credit in one way or another. Institutional funds, and then stocks. I think stocks, there's actually other chains that have done very well on these. I think that, the SEC has like outlined risks when it comes to like tokenized stocks in the form that they're done right now. This is something that we want to see grow. We also want to see it grow like in the right way. And so the nice thing with the growth of these RWAs is like the diversity of growth in terms of who's coming on chain, right? So we just had, AlloyX with China AMC's money market fund has been one area that I think is kind of exciting. I think Spyco launched a new fund as well. And so in general, we've seen kind of more funds also and RWAs launching on Polygon in Q3, and got many more teed up actually for Q4 that we're excited about too.
Yeah, Mark, I'm actually like pleasantly surprised by this slide. I had no idea that the commodities and corporate bond side and government bond side was so massive on Polygon. What do you think is like driving this?
Yeah, so Sandeep touched on this in the intro. Is we've been focused for a long time on like real world use cases and utility in general. And so when we go back to 2022, 2023, and we were working with a lot of enterprises, and then the FTX collapse happened, and a lot of that went away. One thing that we continued to spend time on, regardless of that, was payments and RWAs. That effort actually never stopped. And so I think this is a reflection of this, is that Polygon has been doing this for a very long time. And so when you go into the market and you talk to anyone about tokenization, Polygon's the first chain that probably comes to their mind. And so that's been reflected by continued decisions that have been made in terms of the choice of blockchain to tokenize assets on.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. All right. You also talked about emerging markets, which I want to get into with you as well. We talked about the surge in activity and stablecoin volume on Polygon. We talked about commodities, credit, RWAs, and a lot of this is happening in emerging markets, as this data shows. Can you kind of walk us through what you're seeing on your side?
Yeah. I think this fits into like a broader strategy that we have. So typically, when we look at stable coins on chain, what we see is that the USD volumes and the USD TVL of stable coins is significantly higher than what you see in any non-USD stable coin whatsoever. That has led many teams behind blockchains to just ignore non-USD stable coins. And so that is something that we did not ignore. And this is very much reflected in these numbers. So when we think of like emerging market stablecoins, we kind of like broadly put them in the category of like, LATAM, Southeast Asia, for Africa. Those are like the big ones that we focus on. And so in terms of stablecoin volumes, I think we had like 41% market share across the board. And I think that's something that really stands out when you think of the total kind of volume. And you can see this relative to other chains, right? Like Polygon, and this is something you're going to consistently see when it comes to emerging market stablecoins, is you see DEX volumes here that outpace pretty much every blockchain, actually very much every blockchain, and almost all of the blockchains together. We had 84 billion of total DEX volumes, which is up from 72 billion in Q2 on just these stablecoins. So I think we've had a lot of impact in this area, and it's something that you'll continue to see growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also want to go to the next slide as well. You talked about LATAM, the stablecoin ecosystem on this front. What do you kind of see as like the most significant, maybe out of these three charts, if you could pick a favorite?
Yeah. Look, I think the core here is again the DEX volume, because this actually shows usage, right? So I think like having 61% of like stablecoin transactions, I think ends up being like really important. I think the just number of addresses transacting, you could see that like bleeds purple, because it's very much everyone is choosing to use Polygon. But the DEX volumes end up being really important, because people want to move in and out of currencies, right? And so having the flexibility to do that's important. So one of the things that we focused on is really creating more liquidity in the various LATAM-based stablecoins. And so there's quite a few of those actually. And so providing that liquidity actually allows people to transact. And so while those volumes are actually much smaller than what we see more broadly, when you do create that demand, what we've seen is that there's a lot more users that are actually coming to take advantage of it, because there is a demand there. It's just never really been actually kind of like the supply has never been there for people to take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. How do you kind of see Polygon growing its market share in this sector then, and in this specific region as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very hard to grow market share by a lot when you're already very dominant. But I do think that there's also an advantage when it comes to kind of like network effects around these specific stable coins, and again, like liquidity, right? So as we focus more and more on liquidity, as more and more volumes come in this liquidity, it becomes more desirable to actually trade in those stable coins. And so I think we're going to see more and more increases as a result of that. I also think that the global nature of how we've approached things at Polygon are really important. And so when you think of a local stablecoin, most of the time this is not a local who's deciding to buy that stablecoin, hold that stablecoin, and never move it. Usually what you're seeing is somebody who's moving like in and out of different stablecoins in regions. And so having that flexibility to do that ends up being really important. And so that's the flexibility that we're providing at Polygon.
Yeah, so we've talked about Latin America, and I want to go around to the other side of the world with Southeast Asia and kind of take a look at the charts here and get your take on the growth on that front and what you're seeing here, maybe compared to Latin America or other regions.
Yeah, I think Southeast Asia is just a very similar story to LATAM. I think it's an area that LATAM is actually one that we started focusing on earlier in the story of Polygon. And so you actually see it a little bit further ahead. But importantly, what you do see is that when it comes to DEX volumes, very significant increases on Polygon in general. And I think, again, that's really reflective of the efforts that we've put in providing liquidity into these various stablecoins. And there's always certain ones that like stand out. So for example, like the XSGD, for example, in Singapore, ends up driving a significant amount of volume. There's a lot of demand for it. We partner very closely with StraightX behind it, and that ends up driving a lot of volume. And it's the same story as in LATAM, is when you provide the liquidity and there's demand for it, and now people see that there's supply, they're going to take advantage of that when they want to use it. So I think we'll continue to see that as we provide more and more liquidity and more natural liquidity comes into those stable coins, that we'll see volumes continuing to grow there, and that like the actual number of transactions being executed will continue to grow.
I think it's interesting though, the DEX volume shares for Polygon continues to, just kind of like go and take up more and more market share, right? I'm wondering on your side, like, what do you think is driving specifically that chart to grow more purple, as we like to say?
Yeah, more purple is good, is we should all remember. But I think importantly, it comes down to liquidity. So when we look at the amount of liquidity there are in USD, like base stable coins, it's 99.999% of liquidity. And so what ends up happening is that you might, on most chains, you might see $500,000 of liquidity on and we can pick any stable coin in Southeast Asia or in LATAM. And when you've got $500,000 of liquidity, transacting even $50 ends up creating significant slippage and is not even realistic for everyday transactions. But once you've grown that to $5 million, now when people need to come in and out of a currency, they can do $50, $10, $100 without any problems. And so that just leads to more and more demand for actually using the DEX. And so that continued growth of liquidity with a focus on making that capital available in those stablecoins ends up driving that growth.
Okay, before we talk about what's next and go into questions from the comments, all in all, what would you say are some of the biggest integrations that you want to highlight from Q3?
Yeah, I think in the Q3 thing, the biggest thing that I want to highlight is a lot of the technical work that we've actually done on Polygon. So when we look at, and Cindy touched on some of this, but when we looked at what things looked like before Q3 to where they look at today, we're at a point where the architecture of Polygon POS has actually changed like quite a bit to a even faster chip blockchain and even cheaper blockchain, and one with kind of lower block times, and one where there's no more reorgs whatsoever. And so there used to be questions around confidence people could have in using Polygon for certain types of transactions, payments never really being too much of an issue, but we've basically eliminated those concerns completely, which I think ends up being really important. And then in terms of like partnerships, I think really it comes down to many of these payments providers when you look at them. So we're seeing new ones come on board, but we're also expanding relationships with existing ones. And I think that's just as important. When we think about things at Polygon, it's much less about like how do we bring on a new payment provider and much more about how do we expand what an existing payment provider does. And obviously both of those go hand in hand, are important, but we ultimately want both of those things to be true. And so that ends up being a very big kind of focus on what we're doing.
Yeah, I think maybe your response bleeds into my last question for you, Mark, but kind of on the front of Q4, as we wrap up the year, what can we expect from Polygon to really finish strong here?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. So some things have already happened in that we launched in earlier this month, we launched the Rio upgrade. And so this adds on top of some of the benefits that I mentioned previously, but it now sets up for us getting to 5K TPS and soon like 10K TPS after that. And so, having the speed of transactions there ends up being really important. It's really providing like better finality and more instant finality, which ends up being really important. Those are some of like the key things. But when we think about like payments, the two things that end up being like really important are probably three things: are stability, finality, and TPS. And so increased stability, increased speeds of finality, and then increasing TPS are all things that we focused on. And as we get through Q4 and we've made this like big change in kind of architecture, now we're really talking about continuing to increase that TPS. And that's something that we'll see happening every few weeks in the quarter, or maybe every month. We'll see increases in TPS as a result of that. So that's big on like the technical side of things. On the non-technical side, I think there's going to be a few additional payment providers that we're going to see coming online that I think are going to be really, really important. I think a few announcements around chains coming to the ag layer, which we actually haven't spent that much time on, but some major chains that are going to be either being announced or going live in the fourth quarter, which I think will let everybody know that the ag layer's growth is very real, and a lot of assets will be coming to the ag layer as a result of that. And then I think we're going to continue to see kind of increases in those non-USD stablecoins. Again, this isn't a kind of like point in time for us in terms of, hey, we're going to focus on this for some time and that's it. It's actually very core to our strategy because, again, you need a very complete global network with a complete set of like currencies and assets that are available. So I think those are all things that we will see improving or coming in Q4.
Amazing. Mark, I'm smiling because you were talking about payment service providers that are coming up, and I want to get into the community questions. I know you love answering these, so if people have questions, Mark likes hard-hitting ones, he likes fun ones, send them in the chat. But one of the questions we got was from someone named S1W who said, who is the biggest payment services provider that you've not announced yet?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can't announce ones that we have not announced yet, but I will say that these relationships with PSPs end up being like very important. So we actually, I'll give an example, like one of the biggest companies in the entire world that are global. We just got news yesterday that working with one of the PSPs, they're going to be coming and using Polygon for some payments that they're going to be wanting to do, and these will be pretty significant in size. And so those PSPs end up being important both in terms of the volumes that they bring themselves, but also in terms of the relationships that they bring. And so that's one reason why we're focused there. We're happy to see, like, for example, Stripe launched subscriptions recently, and as folks could see, those were demoed out on Polygon, and so be available on Polygon. So that's something that's really exciting. I think that there's, if you go digging, there's several other like PSPs out there that you'll see kind of on Polygon right now, and we're definitely talking like most of them that are out there, all the major ones. Really, they're all interested in stable coins, and so we'll be working on bringing them all over to Polygon.
Someone else also asked, like, who will be plugging into the ag layer next? Is there any alpha you could share on that front?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I'll say is we'll see an announcement in the next month around one of the biggest financial institutions in the world that are working with one of their teams on launching a chain on the ag layer. I think that's the most that I can say about that since it's not public yet. But that one's going to be very exciting. As I was kind of like I touched on for a second, there's more and more assets that'll be coming to the ag layer as a result of that. And one of the key reasons why they're coming to the ag layer is they want the interoperability, right? And that's something that's very intentional in terms of kind of like the ag layer and the advantages of using that. So we'll see that in the next month or so being announced, and we're actually working very, very closely with the team on making that happen. So we're excited about that launch.
All right, we'll hold you to it in the month then. We also got a question on payments, 2 questions. So first one was from someone named Smiley Glad Hands, which is a fun username. Can we elaborate slightly more on how ag layer helps Polygon in payments? And then someone else named Jamal Reyes asked, why is Polygon going to win payments versus other chains? So I think you could kind of put them together.
Yeah, so I think the ag layer is going to play one role in this. So I'll answer them kind of separately, but
okay, ag layer, Polygon, yes.
Yeah. So I think so when we think of people being able to make payments, there's 2 things that I think are true. Is first of all, they don't want to think about what chain they're on, and second of all is that there's no blockchain in the world that's going to be able to handle payments globally when you take like payments to its full scale. So when we take that second one, like what I'm going to assume is that at some point in time, no matter how performant Polygon POS becomes, its block space will get filled with payments, like period. And we've got two choices at the time. One of them is sit there and say, oh, you need to go use another blockchain somewhere else, like too bad. Or we can be able to spin up another chain connected to the ag layer and execute transactions between those two chains seamlessly so that users don't actually know the difference. And obviously the latter is more desirable. It's more, valuable for Pol ultimately. And so that's really what we care about. And so that's one important role of the ag layer. The second one has to do with, anyone who wants to accept payments, they don't want their users to need to think about what chain it's coming from. Or to need to select chains or anything like that. And so the ag layer and things we're building on top of the ag layer are going to be very relevant here where, when, let's take a fintech, for example, wants to allow its users to make payments, they should be able to make payments that draw from balances that they have on any chain and then execute those payments along the Polygon POS. And an ag layer makes this like a lot more efficient than without the ag layer. So that's the big one. In terms of the broader question, in terms of like why it is that Polygon's going to win payments versus other chains, I think there's a few things to remember. Like, first of all is there's going to be a lot of chains that win. Now there's going to end up being like one leader, but one of the nice things about payments is it's like a trillion and trillion dollar market that many people can end up winning, right? And so I think we'll end up seeing several blockchains that end up being successful in payments. I think when it comes to why is Polygon going to be the leader within all of those, there's a few parts to this. So one is Polygon actually getting built for payments is very important. Almost every other blockchain that's out there is being built for many use cases. When we think of like the Rio upgrade, which is specific to that, we think of the tooling and other off-chain infrastructure that we are building and going to continue to build. These are all things that when you're a payments company of any sort and you're looking at what blockchain to use, you're going to use the one that has the best, easiest tooling for you to use. And someone like Polygon focused on payments is going to be able to offer that, right? And so that's like one like technical side of it. I think then you actually have like the non-technical side, which comes in like multiple forms. One is we have this insane BD team that has relationships globally. So we have a double-digit team that has relationships around the globe and are based around the globe. And they have come together and frankly executed incredibly well. And I think I saw something like 5 deals closed yesterday, just in payments just yesterday from this team, which is crazy in and of itself. I think it's very hard to like replicate that and what exists there. And I think the important thing is you've got a team there who just like wants to win. And overall, that's like very, very difficult to beat. And then the last thing that I'll say is that when you look at payments providers themselves, again, of any sort, they want to be on a network where others are doing the same thing. This is because they know that they're going to benefit from the activity of others. And so when we end up kind of like bringing, one payment provider in Southeast Asia and another one in LATAM, they really actually end up both like benefiting from that because their users can end up, being able to make payments that gets kind of like received in another region and then onboarded or offboarded from that reason and growing. So those are like some of the reasons. I think the very last thing that I'll say about this is we want to create like a very complete stack. And this is something that I don't think has really been done well at all. And I think that something that we'll be announcing more about coming soon, but a stack that really fulfills needs across the board for payments companies ends up being important. And so it's something we're working on.
Yeah. An account named Wealth Pixels asked, where can they find out more about the ag layer to kind of get a sense of what they could build around the interoperability that it enables? Should be an easy one. Yeah.
So if you go to aglayer.dev, that is where you will be able to find details on the ag layer. There's a learn section there that you can use that will kind of like walk you through that. There's also quite a few videos on this. And so lots of different places for you to learn about the ag layer.
Perfect. And then Tulasi Rao Lanky asked, are there any incentive campaigns on Polygon?
Yeah, so we have the community treasury board that exists right now, where incentives are considered. I think the biggest thing, it depends on what you mean in terms of like incentives, like on chain versus if you want to talk about like incentives for using the chain versus incentives for building. In terms of incentives for building, we've moved a lot of that to just Polygon Labs grants, and a big reason for this is just the efficiency of being able to make those. But what we're also seeing, which is very intentional, is that as we gain the lead in payments more and more, there's a natural desire to come to Polygon for that purpose without actually needing grants, right? And so it's something that we're trying to move away from as much as possible. And then the second one is incentives in terms of like on chain, from like lending protocols to DEXs, things like that. I think key thing there is like looking at different apps in the ecosystem and who has different grants programs that are available, or incentive programs. There's probably a few of them that are available all the time, frankly.
Someone else named Food for Thought asked if there's any Web2 partnerships in sight. I think before you talked about the P2P side, and then we also tried to pull some alpha out of you, but maybe if there's anything else you want to add on that.
Yeah, nothing else to add there other than most of what you're seeing in terms of partnerships coming out of Polygon right now are Web2 partnerships. I talked about the payments team, closing 5 deals in the payment space. Every single one of those are Web2 companies. So definitely seeing an increase in those, because there's a lot of like Web2 companies right now in payments that need to be able to close transactions on chain.
Right. And then earlier, while we were talking through the slides, someone named Jason Wisher asked, why does a lot of user/activity, or what does a lot of user/activity translate to? And then the value of the poll token does not seem to connect to the outcome of poll's hype. So your comments on that.
Yeah, so I think look, more transactions equals more fees being paid. That's the key thing here. And you've got 2 different choices when you're looking at a blockchain. Is choice number 1 is increase gas fees, decrease activity, but drive more value to a token in the short term. And in the long term, those who are charging less fees are probably going to eat your lunch. It's just a matter of time. Choice number 2 is you grow for the long term. So you have lower fees that drive less actual fees back to poll in the short term. And then with time, more and more demand increases, the value of block space becomes higher, and the fees that you generate end up being higher. And so the value, the benefit to poll ends up being higher. And we very much fall in that latter camp. I don't try to speculate on why one token is worth more than another token, because this is like crypto and there's no fundamentals in crypto. I think that we'll see fundamentals coming more and more into tokens. It's just a question of when, and it could be quite some time. My view on this is we can play short-term games. You see a lot of short-term games played. Most of the time, those short-term games are destroying a treasury that is being used for those, whether that's paying for expensive KOLs and then you suddenly have no tokens left. But from my perspective, build great projects and products, bring usage, and then try to drive more usage of poll, right? And so one of the things that we've spent a lot of time on is looking at what are staking rates looking like on Polygon versus on other chains. A lot of times you'll actually see the staking rate on poll is lower than you see on other chains. And those are both ones with tokens that are going up, some with tokens going down. And so the question becomes why is that the case? How do you actually solve for that? And so those are the kind of things that we're looking at is really driving more demand to stake poll, which I think ends up being very closely correlated to the value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got a question from someone called nofuturistic.eth. He said, we've seen announcements about potential Polygon DATs and institutional clients potentially staking poll. Does the Polygon team directly assist in these huge endeavors? I think this will be a big catalyst for poll in the next few years. His words, not mine.
Yeah, we have worked with teams. I mean, look, I definitely agree with the idea that the institutional demand for Pol is good, and for a very important reason, which is that you bring in a new set of investors, right? So a lot of the investors who look at Pol right now are just pure like Web3 investors. So super narrative driven, non-fundamentals driven, I would argue most of the time. Typically the shiny new object is the most desirable thing. I think when you are able to bring in a whole new set of investors, more traditional investors, they still follow narratives, frankly, like look at like just typical market, but I think a lot less. And what that ends up meaning is that you have a lot more fundamentals driven investors. And so we do work with teams in terms of trying to drive the institutional demand, which I think ends up being, again, more fundamentals driven. And when you look at the Polygon story, it's much more fundamentals driven than hype driven.
Mm-hmm. Someone named Remnant also asked, would love to know more about Bitcoin liquid staking tokens or LSTs coming to Polygon.
Yeah, I think that's an announcement that we made recently, and frankly, it's not an announcement that I was like very, very close to. So, for me, the way that I look at it is like, Bitcoin is the biggest, crypto asset in the entire world, and the more of that value that you can bring on chain, I think the better. I think the one thing that's important to keep in mind is kind of like value that looks good versus value that is actually like very value additive. So I think a Bitcoin LST is good because it gives like flexibility to people who want to earn Bitcoin or own Bitcoin and earn in like a different way. I think like the downside is that the amount of actually transactions that it drives is like relatively low. And so for me, like having a Bitcoin LST is like a very important, like just like mix in the assets that you have. But I think as like a fundamental driver, I think it's just kind of like one of the pieces.
Mm-hmm. Someone named Dimitri Nikolaros asked, thoughts on Fed's Payment Innovation Conference that will take place later today?
Honestly, I have not focused on it at all. I don't have thoughts on it.
No thoughts yet. We'll see how it transpires, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Someone named Monique Biradar asked, how is Polygon addressing challenges specific to Indian compliance, taxation, or banking integration for local startups? It might be a little specific, but maybe more like challenges in general to the region.
Yeah, I'll say, look, given the background of Polygon initially as what many view as kind of like an Indian-based project, given that Sandeep cares a lot about India, this is an area where we spend time on, right? And specifically, the question is like, how do we actually help projects grow in India? Obviously, things like stablecoins and seeing like an Indian rupee stablecoin would be one of the most exciting things in terms of really seeing that take off. And I think everyone would agree it would probably have very, very high demand. And so, trying to navigate the Indian kind of compliance side of things, and this includes with like major enterprises that we work with in India, is something that ends up being important. It's not something that like we necessarily have like the expertise in across the board, but it's something that we're trying to like drive in terms of like clarity around crypto in India in general, and like how it can be used and when.
Mm-hmm. And last question, Mark, we've got a few of these from the community. Is Polygon leaving the Ethereum community to become an L1?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So look, I think everyone probably read what Sandeep posted in terms of his views on this. It's something that he and I have talked about like quite a bit, and it's less about like leaving Ethereum. Like the reality is that you need to use the kind of technology that like best fits your needs, and that is going to help you grow. And when you look at like Polygon back in the day, like launching on Ethereum made like a lot of sense. And I think it's been very mutually beneficial. I think Polygon's paid like $60 million in fees to Ethereum in general, right? That's like a significant amount of fees. I think it's a lot of value add over to Ethereum. And I think in like return, I think the important thing is it's allowed Polygon to like grow really well. Like you go back to 2021 when Ethereum literally couldn't handle the transactions, and Polygon was there to like bring those transactions on board and keep people on the EVM and in the Ethereum ecosystem. That ended up being like very mutually important. It ended up allowing Polygon to grow significantly, ended up kind of keeping users on Ethereum. And I think one of the things that Sandeep voiced, I think he feels is like a lack of support over the years from that. And a lot of that is a technical purity question, right? It's like, is Polygon an L2? And when you think of the big picture, the answer is more Polygon has paid over $60 million to Ethereum. I think that's the only purity question that you need is like, how much is somebody paying you? And then you think of like the things that have been developed, multiple chains that have been developed on Ethereum, the AG layers built on Ethereum, right? So you think of like all of those things, then you probably call Vault Bridge that's built on Ethereum. It's all, Ethereum. You think of a Polygon versus many L2s. Many L2s have tokens native to their own chains. Polygon is native to Pol, is native to Ethereum. Staking happens on Ethereum. So when you think of all that, and then you think of, okay, what has Polygon gotten out of that in terms of Ethereum supporting them versus supporting, frankly, other L2s? And the answer ends up being, well, there's been significantly more support for those L2s. And so that ends up taking a toll. And Sandeep wanted to like voice his view of like, hey, when you look at that, and then you look at like Peter's letter that he wrote about like the EF, and I think Sandeep started to feel like, hey, am I at the end of the road in terms of the effort that I'm willing to put in without any like return in terms of like that recognition? And this is in a world where him and I know very clearly that there's going to be a significant jump in valuation of Pol just by saying we're an L1 and no longer checkpointing to Ethereum. And so that is something that's always been tempting. The Ethereum community has always said, well, Polygon's going to do that eventually. So Polygon hasn't done that in like 7 years. So at one point you would think maybe Polygon's not going to do that. But it does take a toll on you. So that's where Sandeep's at. I think Vitalik wrote a great response in terms of how he feels about Polygon's contributions and Polygon's and Sandeep's contributions, both in Polygon and like more broadly in the world, because Sandeep's done a lot that people like just don't realize. And so, yeah, when I look at it right now, like, no, I don't think Polygon's going to go become like an L1 like anytime soon. We've said it for a long time that on our roadmap, we plan on becoming an L2, and a lot of this has to do with ZK technology maturing. And so that allowing for us to have like low latency transactions and still very low cost transactions, because ultimately the only thing that matters is the user experience. There's a lot of talk around like L2s and ZK, like who cares about any of it? Do your users have a good experience? Like yes or no is the only question that ends up mattering. And right now, like users have a fantastic experience on Polygon and they deserve to continue to have that experience. And for me, like that's frankly the only thing that matters. Is like I'm going to give users a great experience, going to continue to allow them to grow their businesses and what they do on Polygon. And I think the current architecture does a really good job doing that, and so it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So for now, no, but never say never based off Sandeep's comments and others.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, but we do lean very much towards like never. But it's look, I think it all just depends on look. There's a very new leadership at Ethereum Foundation that shoots things very differently, and I think that they've turned things in a very good direction, very positive, and have been a lot more supportive, frankly, of Polygon lately in many ways. And so definitely seeing a very different Ethereum Foundation right now, which I think is a great thing.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you so much for running through everything that Polygon Labs has accomplished during Q3, answering all the community questions, answering my questions, and just for taking the time, and to Sandeep as well at the beginning. I look forward to talking again with your team again next